do. We save so much money on sick care by just cleaning up fossil fuels and ending them. We save so much money on health care that it's enough to pay the cost of the clean energy revolution. This doesn't cost us, it benefits us in every way imaginable.
Here and now is important. This is Michael Feinstein of the Green Party here in California at a rally recently for Kenneth Mayhew and Jill Stein. And I'm here at the Mayhew rally with Michael Feinstein.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for being on the Nowman show. Now, what exactly is your position with the Green Party right now?
My position is I'm very optimistic about our party. And here's why. I co-chaired the founding meeting of our state party back on February 4th, 1990. And we felt at the time that there are going to be these historic peaks and valleys. And if there isn't already a greenish progressive political party on the ballot when those key moments come, then we miss the chance of taking advantage of them.
What do you see the Green Party's role is in creating these coalitions?
The strategic choice, I think, for progressives is, are you going to waste your time trying the failed experiment of saving the Democrats? Or are you going to work for electoral reform like proportional representation, multi-seat winners in multi-seat districts, where if a party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats? That's the answer in the end. A Green Party under such a system would have 20 to 35% of the vote easy in California and in a lot of states around the country. What the Sanders people who are trying to fight inside the Democrats are missing is they're going to have a civil war in every district with people who don't agree with them. Why you would want to be in a party with people who you don't agree with doesn't make any sense to me.
Besides going out and getting vacuum tubes full of oxygen, he discovered or came up with the idea of investigating how to get old oxygen out of ice cores.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
The permafrost?
Yeah.
He was also involved in that?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Really? I did not. Wow.
Around 1980.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
That's I learn things all the time.
Yeah, they discovered there were bubbles inside the ice cores they'd never been able to get inside. There was CO2 in there. And they analyzed the CO2. They discovered an almost perfect correlation between CO2 and temperatures. In the past, thousands of years ago, as CO2 levels went up, temperatures went up with them. Mm-hmm. As they went down, same story. And I'll say this, I'll just interject this, but I really wonder if we're going to hear a lot of talk about going to Mars. And that's really what we should be doing. It's a huge distraction. Frankly, I think it's a fantasy. But
well, I think it sounds more like it's a distraction.
Oh yeah,
sure. Because the bottom line is we're talking about political economics.
Absolutely right. And we've got big businesses out there whose existence is based on fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And if it is in fact the fossil fuels that are creating this global warming or this climate change, call it what you like, that spells doom for them, and they don't want that to be the case. So you've got this actually a cult of deniers. Some of them are paid big bucks to come up with negative information to poo-poo the idea of global warming or climate. Oh yeah, fake news.
Mm-hmm. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And we should call it what it is, in
my
view, because there's like we've been talking, and we're going to continue talking in another episode. There's plenty of data. There's no need for denial or to call something a hoax.
Well, when you have the IPCC, this international group of scientists, 97-3 maintaining that global warming is a very real phenomenon and it is dangerous.
Yes. Let's start with electoral politics before we move on to the real most important stuff. So did the DNC rig the primaries?
Yes.
Why? Explain why you think that.
So it's not even a think, it's a fact. When the Democratic Party doesn't support all candidates vying during the primary equally, it's rigging the system. If you're putting the thumb on the scale even a little bit, it's rigging the system. If you deny access to the primary, it's rigging the system. And in the case of Bernie versus Hillary, that was belligerent corruption. That was blatantly the Democratic Party denying Bernie Sanders his due. Now, granted, the Democratic Party is its own entity and their own organization, and they can make whatever rules they want. That's the beauty of being a political party. But that doesn't mean that they didn't undermine it or that they didn't rig it in favor of who they wanted to be on the ballot.
Yeah, and there's some historical lessons to learn here too. I mean, we saw something similar in 1944, different circumstances, but at the Democratic Convention in 1944, even though FDR, got the nomination, obviously, during the Democratic National Convention, guess what happened? There was a group that basically got Henry Wallace pushed out of the way so that Harry Truman could become the actual vice presidential candidate.
Capitalist enterprises. In those, here's the typical story. A tiny group of people at the top, the owner, the management that the owner chooses, or in a modern corporation, the major shareholders, usually a dozen or so institutions or people who decide who is on the board of directors. That's usually 15 or 20 people, and they make all the key decisions. They decide what to produce, how and where, and what to do with the products of the labor of all the people. And what about all the people who work in an enterprise? They have no participation at all. They are excluded from deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits and the net revenue. That's not a democratic system. But there is a democratic way of organizing an economy, and it's not capitalism. It's called worker cooperatives.
Because this is a Nowman show, of course, this is a pertinent question. Why worker cooperatives now?
The clearest message from the last election is that people are unhappy with the way politicians operate.
Yeah.
And the biggest part of that is the fact that they owe their allegiance not to the voter, but to the people who paid for their campaign.
That's right.
The big donors that paid for their campaign. So consequently, if we want our democracy back, we need to get money out of politics.
Yeah.
And so I worked a lot on this topic. I work for organized labor, so obviously I do. But
yeah.
There's a point where you watch people come up with various fixes to the economic system, bills to regulate, donations and whatnot. But there is a fundamental principle, and what I watched was that people are putting the Band-Aid here and the Band-Aid there to try to put the finger in the dike or whatever, the little fix-up. But the fundamental principle is that we do not own our own economy. The fact that that so much wealth inequality exists and is fundamental to this, and is one of the greatest problems in our society now.
What does L.U.C.I do? Tell us a little bit about that organization. It stands for
Los Angeles Union Cooperative Initiative. So we operate on a variety of levels. Our fundamental and long-term purpose is to actually incubate, convert, do startups, incubate businesses that are worker cooperatives. But we also mediate that zone between the worker cooperative community and labor unions as they are today. And because the worker cooperative community, you're talking about entrepreneurs, they're usually not people who have been in unions, and so they don't see the natural relationship between unions and worker cooperatives. And then on the union side, we're just really busy fighting back, the attacks on unions, and trying to operate at a scale which is vastly different than worker cooperatives. And so the union community is not really, seeing the worker cooperative community as an alternative for them, because the scale is so much different. So we're trying to mediate that line to get people talking to each other. That's what we do in the Union Co-op Council of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives on a national scale. But L.U.C.I is that group of union activists and that are attempting to do that in the Los Angeles area. So we speak and we try to educate the community, but we also look for opportunities to create worker cooperative businesses. And in Los Angeles, there's been estimated that about 10,000 small businesses will change hands due to the baby boomers retiring.
Wow.
This is, nationwide, there's I think it's $3 to $5 trillion worth of businesses.
Wow.
Some enormous number. I don't quote me on that number because I'm just pulling that out of my memory banks.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of businesses that will change hands due to baby boomers retiring. Now, what do we want? Do we want them to close that business and 20 people each lose their job? No, what we want to do is we want to see them continue through that crisis of leadership. And so we're proposing the alternative of turning them into worker cooperatives. The people that have worked there know how to do their work. They know how to do the job. And they've been working together for a while. So, of course, if they're unionized, they have a tremendous sense of solidarity, which is equivalent to cooperative education. But if they're not, that can be developed. And so, we'd like to step into that void there and help convert those businesses to locally owned worker cooperatives, because then they're going to stay in Los Angeles. They're not going to be closed by their corporate owners and their assets.
They're not going to create ghost towns.
Ghost towns, yes, right, exactly.
Right. Even in Southern
Out of Los
California.
Even
Angeles.
out of Los
Exactly.
Angeles.
Exactly.
Right.
Are the educational institutions involved? We're going to start through community colleges and universities and colleges,
Yes, we
creating
are.
this bridge and institutionalizing that education to bring unions and co-ops together.
Well, yeah, we are building those bridges now. There's a labor studies program at the LA Trade Tech. Southwest College has hosted some workshops in collective remake.
Yes.
Yes.
Which I think would
we're
be
building
another
those
great
bridges
guest
now,
for our show.
because 95% of all business incubators are at educational institutions.
Wow.
So.
Well, one of my favorite sort of lesser-known people is a woman named Charlotte Perkins Gilman,
Yes.
who was a feminist, a suffragette, a radical, a socialist.
Very radical, too.
Yes, who early in the 1900s basically wrote about the inequality of gender in America, and wrote probably 10 books about the economics of the family, about discrimination against women in the workplace, and basically said we have to rethink gender roles.
Exactly.
And that women and men should be equally responsible for raising their children, that women should have employment, that she should be able to go to college. She was kind of a utopian, but she was also active in the women's suffrage movement. And she was a well-known speaker. She traveled all over the country. She had big audiences. She was kind of the Gloria Steinem of her day.
Yeah.
And she was a socialist and a feminist.
And she also lived at the Hull House, right, which was a settlement house
Yes.
created by another person in your book, Jane Addams.
Yes.
So another incredible woman. I know we've talked about this before, the 3 R's, but there could be other things in addition to that. Tell us what we all can do, in our own individual ways to make the world maybe less carbonated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like to go by the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. But you can add to those R's, like refuse, or there are many things that you can do. And I think just becoming aware of the resources that you use, anywhere from what you buy, the amount of plastics that you buy, to the amount of water that you use at home, to the amount of electricity that you use at home, to how often you use your car.
Yes. Use public transportation a lot more.
Correct, yes.
Use hybrid cars, or use electricity more for transportation.
Correct, or plan your routes so that it makes sense and not having to go back and forth. Little things. I think once you're conscious of the resources that you use, then you can really understand how to cut them.
You do a lot of coalition work, bringing groups together. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm with 2 groups, Progressive Action for Glendale. I was born out of the Glendale for Bernie movement. Glendale for Bernie group during the primaries.
Yeah.
And another group is Progressive Asian Network for Action. And
Great.
both groups are working on pushing Medicare for All. We are working with California Nurses Association, which is part of a larger coalition known as Campaign for Healthy California. The administrative people at the doctor's office are fighting with your insurance companies to cover things that you need. I hear from doctors' offices all the time, like working with Medicare is a lot easier than dealing with insurance companies, because there's so many insurance companies, so many different types of patients, there's so many different plans. It's
that
a headache.
alone,
it's
right?
Bloated.
Let alone the profit. That's a good point. Let alone the profit aspect. There's also the interconnecting of all the different sources, to try to get everybody on the same page. So Michael Feinstein says that reforming the Democratic Party is a complete waste of time. Jim, what do you think about that?
I think that we should not reform it. We should change the name to the non-democratic party. And then launder money from them into a new party. No, I have no idea what the hell's going on. I think you guys were discussing earlier, I think the best thing to do is just throw everything we have, you know, whether it's the Greens or the Democratic Socialist Party or against the wall.
A guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families of our country.
Free money for everyone. You know, I favor a guaranteed income. I do favor that as well. And I think as far as worrying about, oh, well, what social services might become redundant or unnecessary, I don't even think that should be in the near peripheral of thought, because the bigger problem here is that, you know, A, we have a shrinking economy as far as what we're producing.
Huge,
B, wages have not kept up with inflation at all.
Yep.
And C, I mean, the wealth disparity in this country is absolutely ridiculous. The average CEO makes 475 times the average worker.
That's
and
crazy.
Adam Smith never foresaw this, by the way. You know.
Well, and it creates this thing too, where it's like you need money or capital in order to feed yourself and provide shelter. And I feel like whenever I get in these talks with people, they're like, well, don't you think hard work should be rewarded? And I'm like, we're not talking about a yacht or a second home. We're talking about like the basic needs so that you don't die out in the elements. And in order to provide those for yourselves, you have to sell your autonomy for 40-hour weeks to someone else. And that, when you frame it that way, there's something inherently gross about it, because we're not talking about rewarding the brightest minds. We're talking about asking people to exhaust themselves just to survive.
We are volunteer lobbyists. I know that's a bad word in many circles. But we talk to them. We explain the benefits of this plan, and this plan is we think is the best one on the block, because it actually, all said and done, it brings money back into the pockets of all Americans. Now, there's a bit of a plan involved in all that. Don't want to get into all the details now, but we make the polluter pay up front. The money goes into a trust fund, and then it gets divided up equally amongst all people and sent back. And we're talking trillions of dollars. So it's thousands of dollars a year per family that comes back.
Well, now it's just, there's a lot of talk about carbon tax. Now, is that what this bill is about and what you're talking about?
Sure. So fundamentally what we're looking for is to levy a tax on carbon, because it's creating so much damage. And the fundamental theoretical principle is that when you're creating so much damage that you should at least pay some kind of a cost. So the idea is to both levy the fee, which is, commensurate as close as possible with the amount of damage that's being done, which of course would be very high if you did it all at once.
Yes, that's right.
But to gradually ratchet up the cost of fossil fuels, so that the true cost, the damage to our society, is then being put where it belongs, which is on the product that's creating it, which is the entire fossil fuel industry.
There are all sorts of solutions out there, as we've discussed many times on this show. We
There
have
really
to be
are.
the ones.
There are
really
solutions.
are.
That's real. There are real ways that this can get better.
That's
The
right.
hope is not lost. It's
So
really
in building
important.
a united left front from a local standpoint, also from there is the state, there is the national, which is why I was bringing that up. It's all connected, and we need to start from the bottom up.
I mean, one of the main things that we talk about at Ground Game and at Power, and when we're working in coalition. So I work with a community organization that's been around since '99 that works in coalition all across Los Angeles and has for a very long time. And one thing that we talk about is alignment versus, being completely partnered on everything, right? It's not important for us to be partnered on everything to the point where every detailed policy, there can't be any hiccups. Like, we have to let go of that idea and really commit to being if we're in alignment with this organization, even if there's gonna be a policy or a measure or proposition that we're not gonna agree on, we're still in alignment, right? I talk a lot about setting a vector for your organization this is the vector that we want to move forward on, and then that allows us to remain flexible and move around within that, right? But continuing to stay on that path.
And Brandon, no, you started to touch upon what the Socialist Party, well, actually it's not a party, the Socialist Organization is about.
Right.
And you said multi...
We're a multi-tendency organization.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
So what that means is that we absolutely do think that electoral politics are important. We want more people to get engaged, like Kenneth, who are going ahead and saying, okay, you know, we're tired of the way this works. We want to bring an alternative to politics outside the regular conservative liberal. But also the idea that we have to be engaged with actual activism, with pressuring politicians outside of elections, and actually building real education around ideology. So we're putting forward something that's different from regular neoliberalism or conservatism, something that's actually truly progressive.
And truly progressive as, and even terminology, like the word socialism.
Right.
Older generations still are not comfortable with that in this country.
Right.
You know, which shows that they're not educated about how their own history of socialism and not educated about socialism as it exists currently around the world.
And one thing that the local Green Party here is doing is we're actually out there in the community. We're out there in Skid Row doing, you know, meals, giving blankets. We're out there in Boyle Heights talking to people who are going to get kicked out of their homes because a new developer is going to build an apartment next there. We're out there, you know, marching and rallying against deportation, and you know when. Or Black lives, you know, when they get shot by police. We're out there in the community, and you don't sort of see that. And when they're like, oh my goodness, you're actually a Green Party member.
Yeah.
You actually are different than what we've seen.
I first found out about the idea also because of the Swiss referendum. Just the idea of it sounded crazy, free money for everybody. It sounded good, I mean, in my situation, in most people's situations. But I did a lot of reading about it, and it really does make sense, Dan, because it's, you know, in the Declaration of Independence, we say everybody has the right to life and liberty.
That's right.
But in a, you know, capitalist society where everything's, you know, determined by money, you have no right to life or liberty unless you can afford it. So. And obviously, okay, 1 in 7 people are in poverty.
Yes.
Simple solution, and hey, this is MLK's words too. The simplest solution to poverty is also would also be the most effective, a guaranteed income.
Does everybody have enough to eat? Do you have enough clothes on your back? Do you have a reliable roof over your head?
Some do.
You do? Do you specifically? Do you?
I personally do.
Yeah.
I feel like I do.
Yeah, privileged enough to be able to.
At times I haven't. You know, I had to scrape through garbage cans and dumpsters and scrounge up $1 just go get $1 sandwich. But you know, I worked really hard, and now I don't have to do that.
Yeah.
But there's too many that still have to do that.
I feel like for me, the majority of why I am so stable is because I have a job that I have a union backing me and my job, and I have tenure.
Medicare for all.
The whole point is public opinion is shifting rapidly on single payer, which is why Bernie has introduced it. We're talking about what we can do now. The Medicare for All bill Bernie just proposed, and by the way, you have people from Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren to Kamala Harris to even Max Baucus, who railed against single payer, went during the ACA negotiations. All of them are saying it's necessary. The Overton window is shifting, and that's Bernie's contribution by submitting this bill.
That's something I really try and stress, is getting people to focus on the military-industrial complex and how that's localized, how it intersects with every other kind of issue we're working on, how it's economically an issue when we're spending over half of our federal discretionary budget on defense, and also, like, as someone who was on the front lines, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, I've seen firsthand the utter failure of our policies, just how flawed they are. So, you know, I can accept that if our counterinsurgency strategy isn't working, you know, what if I can extrapolate that and apply that to basically everything else that the political elites are having us believe is the best course of action, and you need to trust us because we're the experts. And really, we're trying to change that narrative as veterans. Like, no, we're the experts. Like, we were the ones who were actually there. We saw it firsthand. We did these things. Like, y'all never been in combat. Most of them never even served in the military.
The Labour Party in the UK, 6 months ago, who would have thought that Jeremy Corbyn would be gaining as much momentum as he is? Hundreds of thousands of people, particularly young people, are joining the Labour Party.
Well, in my point of view, looking at the Corbyn victory and going over the manifesto, what I discovered is that they have it very well organized, they have it very detailed, and they have, I would not say progressive, they actually have very close, I would call a near socialist concept in Britain, of all places, which is kind of the neoliberal capital of Europe, especially the city of London. It's kind of like our Wall Street. And it took the conservative Tories for a loop, because he had such an outpouring of young voters when he promoted this manifesto, which was part of the platform that he used. And the core of it is something that we're talking about here, is economic democracy, where he went back to the, I believe it was 1976, policy of trying to make industrial level co-ops. I think it was in the aircraft industry at that time.
That's right.
Right. And he wants to bring that back. Well, what happened was you had the Thatcher era, essentially in the 1980s, that came in and was kind of the neoliberal revolution that demolished a lot of the public ownership in the British economic sector. And then you had their versions of the corporate Democrats, was New Labour under Blair. He was kind of their version of Bill Clinton. In fact, they're very close, especially in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And so what
Personally,
they did, right, exactly. What Blair did essentially was went towards a neoliberal direction, was essentially continuing, as some Brits say, essentially Thatcher's policy for her. In fact, I believe there was one quote by Margaret Thatcher. She said, actually, her greatest result of her administration was creating the new Labour Party.
As we try to pass SB 562, while Trump and the Republicans are trying to eviscerate health care in America, and get rid of the Affordable Care Act, which is not great. It was designed by conservative Republicans. It's Romney Care, but it is better than nothing. They're going to create something worse than nothing. And while that's happening, we in
both
California,
sound like they're pretty bad.
They're pretty, well, this is, there are a few features that are better than nothing.
That sounds like evil and lesser
evil.
evil.
Well, yes, but
evil.
the thing is, what we really always wanted, what progressives have always wanted, is single-payer, universal Medicare for all style health care.
And most countries around the world have it.
Everybody's
even
got
Saudi
it
Arabia and Israel.
for a lot less money.
Yep.
There's no insurance company. You remove the middleman, and here's a video about exactly that. So.
Healthcare guarantee. Insurance company, what do you say?
We're making mighty profits on the money you pay.
Health insurance company, what do you do?
We are the only thing that stands between your doctor and you. The health insurance money train is loading up at the station with employer contributions and the premiums you're owing. While we at the health insurance company wait in anticipation. When the train gets here, we get to decide where all that money's going. We take 30% of the money when it gets to us. A bit for advertisements and a chunk for administration. And lobbying and something we don't publicly discuss. The millions of dollars we pay for executive